All right, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to be in the book of Genesis, and 22 will be our primary text. We'll look at that today. The class is talking back to God, and we're looking at those who do and those who didn't and should have. And today is the didn't and should have one. So we'll discuss a little bit about Abraham and the things that are going on there. Come on in. Morning.
I'm sorry, George. Genesis 22.
Just 22.
Just 22.
Yeah. We'll cover the first 19 verses. Hopefully you'll let me finish before you shoot yourself. But, we're going to look at Abraham, and there's some interesting things about him that we don't think about, and maybe because we don't put them together this way. And so I'm going to try to put it together and see what you think about some of these. Chapter 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. All week I've been thinking, how am I going to start this thing? And I went over different ways. Actually, it's more than a week, but just kind of, well, I'll start here, or I'll start there, or I'll go over here. And this morning it finally hit me. Why is God testing Abraham? Why is he testing him? And the common answer we might come up with is, he's testing his faith. Is that really the case? Is that really the case? And so that's what we're going to look at as we go through here, through some of these texts. Is that what God is concerned about, or are there other things that God is interested in? And something maybe lacking in Abraham's life or in his focus, in some of that. Get everybody in here. Take your time. No one's in a hurry.
Okay.
No, I just let everybody get in and settled, and that'll be. All right, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we're thankful that we can come together and study your word. Thankful for your blessings. Thankful for the opportunities we have to come to know you better. We're thankful for the congregation here and for our gathering together, this Bible class and other classes. And we're just thankful for those who lead us, the elders, the ministry staff, and so forth. May we always trust in you and walk with you, Father. In his name we pray. Amen. Why is God testing Abraham? That's the question. What's the purpose for the test? What if we say it's testing for his faith, is that really the case? When you think about Abraham, you go back to chapter 12, end of 11, chapter 12. God tells Abraham, or chapter 12, verse 1, go from your country and your people and your father's household to a land I'll show you. So get up and go. Well, Abraham does that. Well, that's faith. I mean, he's going someplace he doesn't know where he's going. And so he goes, he takes Lot with him, they go to Canaan. Chapter 13, Abraham or Abram and Lot split the land. 14, Abraham rescues Lot from being kidnapped or captured in war. Chapter 15, the Lord makes a covenant with Abram or Abraham, and the covenant is basically a typical style covenant of that time period. He cuts animals in half, he spreads them apart. Abraham is put into a deep sleep, and what is it now? Let me find. It's one of these pictures the sun has gone down, and a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appear and pass between the pieces. The Bible has, Steven Spielberg has nothing on the Bible. I mean, who would have thought up a smoking fire pot and a torch coming through a bunch of dead animals? That's what the Lord does. It's just like going back to the garden when they're kicked out and you've got the flaming sword going back and forth. I don't care about the cherubim. I know what they are. I want to see the sword going back and forth, you know, what type of thing that is. So, but you have this, and that's a form of faith. He went out there, he got the animals, he fell asleep, and God gives him the covenant again and expresses it that we're going to keep or trust this covenant. We're going to keep it. Chapter 16, Hagar and Ishmael, we'll come back to that. Chapter 17, circumcision, and so Abraham is kind of overshot. Let's see. In my order here, right? Abraham has overshot Canaan one time, and he tells Sarah to say, I'm your sister, or he's my brother. And then chapter 18, we find out about Sodom and the cities of the plain. And here we see Abraham, what does he do? Well, he comes to God, 3 visitors come, 2 of the angels go forward, the 3rd visitor stays, he's identified as God. You can debate all that. We're not going to debate that, but however you want to view that as an angel of the Lord or the Lord himself or however that works. There are just some things that sound good from one author and sound good from another author, and so I'm open to go any way you want to go with who that is. But one stays and says, well, we're not going to hide what we're going to do to Sodom from Abraham. So he goes and tells Abraham, Sodom's going. It's been wicked and it needs to be destroyed. And Abraham comes and says in verse 16 and following, after the men leave, the Lord explains the details as to the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham appeals to God and says, if there's 50 righteous people there, would you destroy the city? And God says, no. Now this is not haggling. Haggling is, I start at 20 and you start at 100. And we work our way down. I had a cousin that loved to haggle, especially with Jewish people. He had a store he always went into and they would haggle over something. That was just the way he was. This is not haggling. Abraham picks a number and God says, okay. Just like that. And he goes 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. And then he stops. You think if Abraham had said 5, God would have said, okay. Now remember, Moses, what did Moses do? Last week we looked at Moses. Moses said, don't destroy the people. And God said, okay. So he's open to say, I can bring judgment and make Moses the leader of a new nation. But Moses says no and reasons with God. And so God said, okay, I won't do that. And one of the prophets has the same thing. You see what do you see? And he says, here's one of those, my mechanics are really well, thing that swings back and forth in a plumb, what is that what it's called? Help me out, Jack. Where's all the engineers? Well, I see that and say, well, I'm going to do this to Israel. And the prophet says, no. And God says, okay, I'm not going to do it. So God's willing to say, I'm not going to do the thing I said I was going to do. And so he does that here. He says, I'm not going to destroy Sodom for 10 righteous. And you have to wonder again if Abraham said, don't destroy it. Whether the Lord said, okay. That doesn't mean Sodom can get away. Okay. That doesn't mean something will something will happen in some type of judgment. But at this moment, God would say, okay, I think. Now that's just speculation. A lot of this is going to be circumstantial evidence. But both sides have it. That's kind of why this discussion is going on this way. So, of course, there's not 10 righteous people in Sodom, and it's destroyed. You have to wonder about that, but that's for another time. Again, Abraham goes back into the Egyptian area and tells Sarah, say you're my sister. So he does that again. We see in chapter 17, verse 18, after Abraham is told he's going to have a son at a 100-year-old man and Sarah at 90, Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. And then what does God say? Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son. Ishmael will, verse 20, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him, and I will make him fruitful, and will greatly increase his numbers. And you can read on in that. And then in chapter 21, verse 11, well, verse 10, Sarah's upset with Hagar and the mocking of Ishmael against Isaac, and basically says, get her out of here. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God, now remember, we know the story. Who gave Hagar to Abraham?
Sarah.
Now she's upset. And, so all these things are happening. Abraham sees Ishmael as important, firstborn. He's important in the culture of the day. I'm going to put my hands in my pocket. I talk too much with my hands. Then he says in verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be distressed or so distressed about the boy or your slave woman. Listen to what Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So 2 times he appeals to God about Ishmael. Now, we're back in chapter 22. Why is God testing Abraham? We see he's got faith. He calls on God twice with Ishmael. He has that covenant with the fire pot smoking through the animals and all that. He comes to a land God shows him. He overshoots it sometimes, but he comes to it, doesn't always stay there. So he does appeal to God, especially for Ishmael. But what about Sarah? In both cases where Sarah is told, tell them you're my sister, he doesn't appeal to God. He doesn't say anything to God. And so it's God who has to come and intervene in the situation. One in a dream, both in a dream, I think. And like I said, I came up with some of this class. I have been looking at this for about 2 months now, and I came up with some of this. This is what came up this morning. So it's a little fresh, and I didn't read some of these back texts. But Sarah, Abraham doesn't appeal to Sarah. And so now we come to 22. God's going to test Abraham. Abraham, God said. And the word for God there is El Elohim. It's not Yahweh, it's El Elohim. There may or may not be a difference in there. Elohim can be God in heaven, God, our God, or it can be any God, just depending on the context. I don't know if that's important, but anyway, think about that. Abraham says, here I am. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Now, up to that point, who do you think that would be? Something to think about. And then God says, Isaac. Now, God has been telling Abraham, Isaac's the chosen one. He is the one I'm going to bless the nations through. He's the one who's going to fulfill the covenant. But Abraham keeps his focus on Ishmael. Hence the two appeals. Take whom you love, your son Isaac, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. And Abraham said, what did Abraham say? Didn't say anything.
He did what he was told to do.
He did what he was told to do, but he didn't say anything.
He didn't plead. Like, you know, God, why would you want me to
Um,
do this? He didn't plead with them like before.
Right.
He didn't
Why not?
be a mediator.
I mean, he's shown he can plead with God. He can debate with God. He can talk back to God. That's what the class is about. But he doesn't do it here. And we have to wonder why.
I think because he was so partial to Ishmael being blessed, and he would go back and forth with Sarah. So I guess he felt like either way God told him to go with Isaac, it would still be okay with him.
Okay.
If he had to go through with the sacrifice, Ishmael would still be here.
Good point. That's very good. Look, there's no wrong answers because the text is really, like I said, a lot of this is just circumstantial evidence or circumstantial ideas. The text doesn't tell us a lot of things. We're asking the questions and wondering what's happening here. But maybe we can come up with, and that's, I thought about, that's a really good point, you know, there's still Ishmael, so, you know, if Isaac dies, well, you know, I mean.
He had to be the person to stand up for Ishmael, because no one else.
But that's true too.
Sarah was there for Isaac because that was both of their firstborn.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting question, because we read here in verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him two of his servants, and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. So he takes two servants. Some translations say young servants, but only two. You notice Abraham gets up. Abraham's first thing, he's old. Let's date Isaac. Isaac is probably 17 to 20. Okay, let's not get the little kid about this tall, because that's not the situation. Many of us, I don't, but I don't have a problem with parents, or maybe a dad will say, well, that's my boy. 40 years old, but that's my boy, you know, because that's how we speak. So when you say Isaac or a young man, we're not talking about a little kid. It could be, but the context seems to suggest Abraham's got some servants who are young, not necessarily experienced, and maybe because they're youth, they're not going to talk back to Abraham. What are we doing? You know, asking questions. You know, I don't know how many of us had kids that ask questions. You know, how many of us? Oh, I better not say that. Anyway, I can get in a lot more trouble, and I won't do that. So he's the one who. What does he? He gets up. He loads the donkey. He saddles it. Is the idea. He cuts the wood. He puts the wood on the donkey, and then he sets out with Isaac and two servants. So Abraham does all this. So now the next question is, where's Sarah? Now, can you imagine having a conversation with Sarah? God told me to go sacrifice Isaac. That conversation would end right there. You know that. You know that as what? You're not doing that. I'll take him and go someplace. Jonah ran from God. You know, people run from God. You can imagine Sarah in that conversation, what that would be like. So, does Abraham tell her?
No.
Is he quiet about it?
Yes.
Sneaky? I know men aren't like that today, are they? Okay. So they take off. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw a place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey." He's concerned about the donkey. "While I and the boy go over there, we will worship and then we will come back to you." That sounds like faith. it seems to be, we're going to come back. The servants don't know what's going on. Isaac doesn't know what's going on. He hasn't talked to Isaac. You know, I can understand maybe trying to calm down a 10-year-old, but if Isaac's somewhere between 17 and 20, maybe that might not go well. You know, teenagers do tend to ask questions, and they can get really annoyed and pointed at it. Abraham, verse 6, took the took the wood of the burnt offering, placed it on his son Isaac. That's why I think he's older, because you're going to, if you have an 8-year-old carrying a bunch of wood, you'll probably get 100 yards before. Are we there yet? This is too heavy. I can't do this. So you have to understand. That's why I think Isaac is a young man who's capable and has done this before. So he's not has a problem with this. So he placed the wood on Isaac. He himself carried the fire and the knife. The fire, it would be in a little pot. There's a movie that was a made-for-TV movie, and it was on Genesis, and I can't remember all, but what really came to light for me was this particular scene. They had a little fire pot, and you would just walk along with it, so the fire would burn all the time. So that's how, of course, Dad's got the fire pot, and Isaac's got the wood. But Dad's 100+ years, and Isaac isn't, so I would do the same thing. So then he has a knife, and the knife is, from what scholars are saying, is a butcher knife. Maybe not like what we look like, but you were offering a sacrifice, so you're going to have to cut up an animal, and it's a knife enough that, you could cut its throat, which was the means by which they did that. They would cut the throat to kill the animal, and then drain the blood and so forth. When they, let's see. So Isaac, the two of them went together. Verse 6. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, first time Isaac talked, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "Here's maybe some faith again." "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. So you see together twice there, and Abraham saying God will provide. There's an interesting cartoon. I like it. It's funny for this situation. It's a modern speech type of thing, but it's funny, but it does make you think. Here's the wood for the sacrifice, Dad. Groovy. You can't tell where this got from. Here's the dagger for the sacrifice, Dad. King. Where's the sacrifice? God will provide, Isaac. And then the next to last panel says, did you say God will provide, Isaac? Or God will provide Isaac? Come here, son. Last panel. I ain't budging till you put a comma in. So you kind of get an eye. But that's the idea. Well, it's funny, but it makes you think about the situation when Abraham says, God will provide my son. It's kind of deceptive in a sense. He knew what he was going. Abraham knew what he was going to do. Isaac had no clue. But we go on. When they reached the place, this is verse 9, when they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Okay. 100-plus-year-old man, 17 to 20-year-old boy. How does he do it? You just think, oh, I'm going to tie you up and lay you on the wood because you're the sacrifice. Do you think that would go over well? You think Isaac, there's nothing in here other than offering up Isaac. Isaac just had no communication with God. We don't know how much Abraham has told Isaac about God. Do you think Isaac is going to be a happy camper about this?
I think Isaac being Abraham's son, he's a seed, so he has to have faith somewhere, knowing his dad is gonna take care of him despite of what's going on.
That, I have no problem with that. I think, again, we can go any number of ways and nobody's wrong, because the text doesn't tell us a lot. But it's just kind of interesting, did Isaac have faith? Was Abraham, I'm going to offer you, God said to offer you, and you have to wonder. I mean, many of us, and we've all heard people say, I don't know if I could offer up my son like that. Well, the first thing you say is, wait a minute, Lord, what are you doing? And you got to consider, God is not, is he like the other gods around the nations that offer up human sacrifice? When you read through the rest of the Bible, realize God is against human sacrifice? That every nation that did that, it was destroyed? So there's a interesting conflict going on here. But it could be Isaac would have faith from his father. Some type of faith from his father. Go ahead.
Maybe Isaac's faith needed to be tested also. Since
Could be. Could be. Yeah. We're not really going to take a deep look into Isaac, but Isaac doesn't, you read Isaac, he's only got one chapter in the book. And there's some favoritism in there, and even though he stays married, he doesn't have but one wife, which is a positive for him. There's a lot of other things going, and Rebecca was sight unseen. Another interesting part of that story. So,
Well, I think irregardless, Isaac respected Abraham, and he was his child, and
Okay.
he's going to be very obedient to him.
all right. Again, another possibility. Again, no wrong answers.
Yeah.
No wrong answers in this. So Isaac, he binds Isaac, lays him on the altar, reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. The angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And the second time he says, here I am. Abraham replies, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. And he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it on the burnt offering as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. And it's called that to this day. On the mountain of the Lord will. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So that's what happens there. Now remember, Abraham says to Isaac, Lord will provide a sacrifice. How many of us, have you ever been driving and talking on the phone? If you're willing to admit that. Or if you are allowed. I practice sermons in classes in the car because I drive up to Navasota on Saturday, so I have an hour to talk to myself. Sometimes I answer myself too. And doing that is fun, except when you miss your turn, right? And you miss the turn, and wait, what happened? How did I get here? And you're lost. Or you've been on the phone, and I'm going to tell a story. My wife called me, said, I'll be home a little later. I was talking on the phone with somebody, and I missed my turn. Yeah, been there, done that. We all have. Abraham's so focused on offering up Isaac that did he not look around for what God would provide? If he said God would provide, wouldn't you think the first thing, I know he said offer up Isaac, but wouldn't you think, maybe there's something around here? That ram caught in that bush had to be there for a while. Otherwise, he'd have been making noise.
But didn't he do that once and make a mistake with Hagar?
Well, in what sense?
In that he was promised and he found his own way to fulfill that promise.
Okay.
So
yeah.
if he's up there, he was told to
Good.
sacrifice Isaac, that would just be making the same mistake twice.
There you go. So there's another perspective of that. There's all kinds of questions that come up with this. We have no answer to it. But we're still asking the question, why was Abraham tested? And then what was the test for? Different parts of that test. Anyway, so he offers up the sacrifice. The angel of the Lord in verse 15 called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. So you go back and there's that covenant renewed again or restated again. But this time in the context of Isaac. Up to this point, it doesn't seem that Abraham, even though God has told Abraham, you're going to have a son in your old age, basically, and he is the one I'm going to bless the world through.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry.
I just agree with
Yeah.
you. I'm reading the scripture here where he said, your offspring, if indeed you can count them, look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be.
Yeah.
So,
He's stating the covenant in a context that he hasn't stated it before.
yeah.
Isaac is involved. All right, verse 19, and then we'll come back and kind of make some comments. Anybody wants to. Verse 19, then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Notice that? What's missing? Abraham and Isaac went together to the mountain. Abraham comes down by himself. Where's Isaac?
As I just assumed, he just wasn't mentioned. Not that he wasn't there.
That's either he was very quiet, and for some reason he's expressed every verse that he's talked about, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 verses. Isaac and Abraham are together. It's either the boy or your son or whoever. Abraham, Isaac, all the way through except this verse. For some reason in this verse, Isaac's not there. So what's happening? Well, there's some interesting things we can look at. First of all, the question is, many of us would see this as a test of Abraham's faith. Don't have a problem with that. I think that's part of it. But I think there's other things in here as well. Verse 2 says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. But the angel says twice to Abraham, in verse 12 he says, now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son, but does not say whom you love. Also, again in verse, verse 16, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. Well, doesn't he love his son? It's God who said, take your son, your only son, whom you love. And then God says, you took your son, your only son. Where's the rest of it? Something's missing there. Is Abraham missing somewhat of a love for his son? Defends Ishmael, no problem. Not so much Isaac, it seems. Maybe so. Again, these are just ideas that have to be are thrown out with the questions that we're asking, because we really don't know all the conversation going on. Is it to make Abraham think about Isaac? We'll come back, the other point we'll come back to in a little bit. Then there's a situation with God himself. How does Abraham view God? Has he learned the idea of being merciful? You know, Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed. Ishmael is blessed by God twice because of Abraham. And there's blessing and mercy and all that. Even though Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham got the number down to 10. I mean, we would be glad to argue with God if we had some place where we didn't want people destroyed and just bring it down to 10. If you pray for Putin, you want to, I can go both ways with this. I can pray that, it would just get eliminated completely, because there are Psalms that kind of suggest that. But you can also say, well, can you remove him from office and send him into exile or something? And show your mercy to him in that sense. There's a lot of ways we can argue things. So how did he see God? Did he see him the way Moses saw God? And Abraham was a friend of God. That's somewhere it says that. Abraham had faith. Some faith. Somewhere. Again, let me go back and say, Hebrews 11 is a great chapter. All those men and women of faith. And you read through there and say, wow, and Abraham, this story is one of the illustrations the Hebrew writer uses. But when you read Abraham's story, there's some issues. Sarah, that's one of them that Abraham has a situation with. When we look at men and women of faith, would you say, who would you choose? Well, we would choose David, we would choose Abraham, we would choose Moses. How many, but he lists a whole bunch. He says, would you choose Gideon? Would you choose Samson? Now, Samson's big, strong, but he's got problems. And he's got an attitude as well. And he can't get along with women. That's another issue with him. And yet he was a man of faith. And I can make that point. I mean, his hair came back and he destroyed the temple. So how about Japheth? If you're going to teach your child about having faith, would you pick Japheth? Japheth said to the Lord, if you deliver me from my enemies, I will offer the first thing that comes out of my house to you. In those days, everything was in the house. Animals were kept in the house. Sheep, chickens, goats, whatever. Because they had to be protected. There weren't walls. Not everybody lived in walled cities. You lived out in the country. If you lived out in the country or in a small village, you didn't have any walls. Well, what came out of his house? His daughter. Is that faith? And you read the story, and she accepts it. So that's another question with Isaac. Does he accept this? We're not told. So I think there's a challenge to his love. There's a challenge to who God is. And there's a challenge to his faith. And depending on how you look at it, he was either somewhat successful or somewhat of a failure in the test. So it depends on how you want to look at it. And like I said, I can go either way. A few other things to be look at here. Let's see how much I can get out of the way. One of my well-known maps, drawn quite accurately. We have the Dead Sea, the Mediterranean, the Aqaba area, Egypt. I didn't draw in the Nile. And the text, there are several different texts. Jerusalem represents Mount Moriah. Most scholars think that's where the sacrifice was. Hebron, which is Bethlehem and Hebron, we find out in chapter 23, Sarah dies, she's living in Hebron. And verse 19 of chapter 22, Abraham goes to Beersheba. And the desert is the desert of Beersheba. If you look at maps even today, there are deserts within deserts. It doesn't make sense, I know. I just call it one desert and save it all, but there's deserts within deserts to mark an area. Ishmael is in the desert of Paran after they went to Beersheba. So Hagar gets a wife from Egypt while he is in Paran. And that's back a couple of chapters. And then in chapter 25, we find out that Isaac is in Beer Lahai Roi. So they're scattered all over. And it kind of makes me think, that's not much of a family when you think about it. They're kind of scattered. I don't know if that has any effect on anything. I think somewhere along the way, Abraham and Isaac have, in some sense, reconciled after all these events. Chapter 24, Abraham seeks out a wife for Isaac. Hagar went to Egypt, and Abraham says, go to back over here to where his family is. And Rebecca is in that situation. So, any comments or questions? Do we have a few minutes? Oh, we have about 5 minutes yet. Nobody's going to throw any darts then?
I almost wonder if the absurdity of the story is sort of part of the point of it. Of all the stories that Abraham would have been involved with over the years, this one is pointed to, it's talked about in the New Testament. I don't know, makes me wonder, I don't know, what else is going on here that we miss
Yeah,
based on our distance, you know?
that, and we just don't have all the facts.
Yeah, exactly.
We can put stuff together, but circumstantial evidence can be drawn different ways.
Right.
And we can look at the same thing and see different things. So that's why there's no wrong answer in any of this. But yeah, it seems absurd in some sense. Sometimes we make a comparison between Isaac and Christ. We'll say Isaac, was sacrificed like Jesus was. Well, there's one major difference though. Jesus volunteered. He went willingly, just as Jacob's daughter went willingly, or was willing involved in the sacrifice. We don't get that indication with Isaac. He may have, but we don't get that indication. He was bound. That's not being voluntarily sacrificed. Okay, that's being, I'm going to tie you up tight. You're not going anywhere till I get your head cut off. So it's.
Well, I was wondering about that though. Did they always bind the sacrifices before that? Like,
No, usually they got behind, slit the throat, and that was the end of it. They didn't have to bind them. Now, I'm sure if it was an ox, it might be a little different. Somebody had to hold the ox, stretch him out, front and back, how they do cows, obviously the bigger the thing, the more problem. But I don't think that, you can't bind an ox.
Yeah.
Unless you lay it on, tie up. Yeah, now I'm confusing Texas and with those longhorns and the cattle rodeos.
But apparently when it came to human sacrifices, depending on the age of that child, they lived among the heathens and they sacrificed their children.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they put them in ovens, in many cases.
Yeah, there's different, that was the Middle East, you're right about that. Incas and Aztecs and all, they just cut people up alive. So, they were just different, which makes me wonder why, when we talk about the Mayas and the Incas and the Aztecs, they kind of disappeared. You have to wonder, you start seeing all the drawings, you wonder why God would get rid of them pretty quickly. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's an excellent point. There were different ways to do it. Hitler was terrible, and the concentration camps or the death camps were horrible, but not uncommon. It's sad to say. Humanity is just prone to do the same thing over and over.
They talk about Abraham and Sarah being so old to have children, and yet after Sarah died, he married again and had 6 children.
Thank you. I didn't bring that up. I was supposed to do that. Chapter 25, oops. Chapter 25, Abraham took another wife named Keturah. She bore 6 sons. And what's interesting here, he names the sons. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. So there may have been, again, reconciliation. While he was still living there, he gave gifts to his sons, the sons of his concubines, and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east, again. And maybe Ishmael was involved. One translation has Ishmael and the others, but I think Ishmael stayed in his general area, and the other sons were sent back to the Babylonian, Arabian Peninsula area. And then he died at 175, and after verse 11, after Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived in that nice long name. That's the only time God blesses Isaac. We don't read of Abraham doing that. Don't know why. Again, I might have missed that, or he got him a wife, so there may have been something. But the firstborn was Ishmael.
George, you mentioned about what things we don't know that transpired between God and Abraham. But I think the important thing is that whatever transpired between the two that we don't know about, that we can't read about, evidently they were pleasing to God. Else he wouldn't have put him in that book of faith.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah.
Whatever happened.
Yeah, there's no doubt Abraham. Faith is one of, and again, I didn't bring this up, but faith is one of those things we may have to take another look at, because it's not just simply first thing, it's going up. It's not that. It's a roller coaster ride. And so there are times when we're strong, there's times when we're weak. And we shouldn't let people say, well, you don't have enough faith. Well, yeah, I'm struggling here. I'm having a hard time with God. And there's nothing wrong. We'll talk about that. That's why we're talking about talking back to God. And we'll bring that up in another class. Next week, Psalm 22, and if you'd like to read Mark 15, 31. And there's some outlines on that paper out there if you haven't found one. Thank you very much. Thanks for the comments and the questions. Really interesting and good. So.